Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, novel editor. Today I am finally back with a new video. I know it's been a while and life seems to just always get in the way every time I try to make new videos and work on the channel. So I really appreciate you guys sticking it out with me. And if you are new, welcome of course to the channel and thanks for giving my videos a chance. So today we are going to talk about scenes. I know we've talked about scenes before in the past, but today I want to focus less on specific structure and strategy and more focus on diagnosing a scene. So what can we do when we know a scene isn't working well, but we're not really sure why? So that's what we're focusing on today. I made a flowchart to go along with this video. I will be putting the flowchart up in the video up here so that you can see it while I'm talking and hopefully understand it a little bit better. But you can also download it. The link will be in the description, so you can go and grab that whenever you want. I will be referencing notes over on the side here. I apologize if that's distracting to anyone. I just don't want to miss anything, and it's a lot to go over and remember, and I don't want to not provide some of the information that I think is essential to understanding the flowchart. So we are going to jump right into the flowchart. So at the very top is, does the scene move the plot forward? So this is a really big question for any scene. By moving the plot forward, what we're referring to is changing the direction of what the character needs to do. So the character needs to now do something that's different than what they would have done if the scene hadn't happened. So maybe they experienced a setback, or maybe they acquired a clue or a new piece of information. Whatever it is, it could be positive, it could be negative, it just has to change what the character does. You could also think of this as a sort of chain. So the plot is a chain with links. If you are able to remove one of those links and the chain is still strong and makes complete sense, that scene does not move the plot forward. If the plot is moved forward by a scene, it's very integral to the plot. So that's where we want to start, is asking that question. Does this scene function as a strong link in the chain that's absolutely essential to understanding the plot? So we're going to say for now that we're saying yes, that it does move the plot forward and it is essential to the overall plot of the novel. So from there, we're going to ask, does the reader need to see this happen? So by see, I mean dramatize the scene, play it out, flesh it out. Does the reader need to really experience the unfolding of this scene, or do they really just need to know that it occurred? So sometimes we have scenes where we're really just passing time or changing locations, and the reader really doesn't need to experience this firsthand. They really just need to know that it happened. Less often you might have a situation where there is plot development, but that plot development doesn't really need to be seen by the reader. So perhaps the character is going to go to a library and they're not going to find any information there. You could flash out the scene and have them go to the library and try to get information and negotiate with the librarian or whatever to get assistance. But really all that you need from that scene is just, there was nothing in the library. So sometimes it is a good option to, in that case, just summarize at the beginning and cut the scene. Just summarize at the beginning of the next scene, or explain in a scene that already works well. We didn't find anything in the library, or there was nothing in the library, or this trip to the library was a total bust, and just leave it at that. You sometimes really don't need to show everything to the reader. Sometimes it's okay to just say that it occurred. So that's the question, does the reader need to see the scene happen? So if the scene does need to be seen or dramatized, so the reader does need to see it, and it's still just not really working very well, we want to move on to ask, is there a conflict? Does this scene have something that's really at risk for the character? A common problem when it comes to conflicts with writers is believing that a conflict is just something bad that happens. So a conflict is not just a bad thing that occurs. If a character gets into a fight with their best friend, that's of course bad, but it's not a conflict, because a conflict requires that the character have a goal and that the antagonist, or whatever the antagonistic force is, stands in the way of that goal. So for example, if a character gets into a fight with their best friend that they had planned this duet with. They were going to audition together for this musical, and it meant so much to the protagonist. And then this big fight causes the best friend to drop out of the audition right before they're about to perform. That's a big conflict because that stops the protagonist from being able to get what they want, which is to succeed in this audition. So keep in mind that a conflict isn't just a bad thing. This can sometimes trick writers into thinking that scenes have structures when they really don't. So make sure that the conflict is genuine. So if in that case, we're going to say that the conflict is there and we do have a conflict. Obviously, if there's not a conflict, add a conflict, but we're going to say that there is a conflict. We're going to move on to, is it obvious to the reader that this scene pushes the plot forward? So sometimes as writers, we have ideas and plans and these visions for how the scene integrates into the broader plot, but that's not visible to the reader. It may be visible later on. There may be a long-term impact of this plot, of this scene, sorry. There may be a long-term impact of this scene that the reader doesn't see until way later. But if you have a scene and it's really not feeling right, there's a good chance that it doesn't have enough momentum, even if there is a conflict, because the reader can't see the source of that momentum. They can't see how it's pushing the plot forward. It's just not clear. So adding that to the scene, a clear impact so that it acts as that sort of link in the chain and the reader can see that and sort of track that, those links, track them together, that will make a big difference in creating a sense of momentum and a sort of energy behind the scene. So if there isn't an obvious impact on the plot, adding one will be really helpful. If there is already an impact on the plot, then turn your attention towards the character. Does the character experience an emotional shift within the scene? Sometimes a scene can feel really dull or flat, even when there's a really big conflict or a really big event, because the character just isn't experiencing a big enough emotional shift. For example, if the character has to give a really big speech and they believe that the speech is going to go horribly and then it does go horribly, that's not that compelling of an emotional shift. A more compelling emotional shift might be that the character thinks that this is going to go really well and then it goes really terribly, or they think it's going to go really terribly and it goes really well. It could even be that the character thinks it's going to go horribly and then it goes even more horrible than they could have ever imagined and makes everything a million times worse. All of those will be more interesting, compelling, emotional shifts that can really help if what you're finding is that your scene is feeling a little bit dull or emotionally flat. So, if there's not an emotional shift, add one. If there is an emotional shift, or if you add an emotional shift and then you have the scene and it has a conflict, an impact on the plot that's obvious to the reader, and this emotional shift, and it's necessary to move the plot forward, so everything is in place, but the scene still doesn't work. Most likely what you're looking at that point is a structural problem. So what's occurring is the scene doesn't work with where it's placed structurally within the novel. For example, at the end of the first quarter, we expect to see a point of no return where the character can't go back and sort of back out of the conflict or step away. If you have a scene in the second quarter where the character is stepping away from the conflict and they're disengaging from the conflict and they're doing that very easily, that's going to feel very odd structurally. It's really not going to fit with the pacing and the overall flow of the novel. So a good sign that this is what you're experiencing is if when you're editing the scene by itself and you're just taking the one scene and reading it and looking at it, it works really well. But then when you read it in context of the broader novel, it just feels odd or it feels awkward. Maybe the pacing feels really fast or slow, or the emotions feel wrong even though the character is not acting out of character for themselves. So if that's the case and you're facing structural problems, it might be possible to shift this scene a little bit so that it better fits the structure, so it better fits where it's placed structurally. It might also not. There are times where you just really can't place a certain type of scene in a certain point in the novel, given everything else that you have set up within this specific story. I will go over structure. I want to make a more in-depth video on structure here soon. I do have older videos on structure, but I think they're quite old, and I really want to revamp them and sort of improve them. So I'm going to put a link in the description to other resources besides me where you can learn more about structure if this is what you're facing. But do stay tuned because hopefully within a month or two, I'd like to have a video up about structure. Fingers crossed, everything going well. So if that's your problem, unfortunately, there's no really fast or easy solution, and you might be looking at a lot of need for brushing up on structure and how it works in order to really understand and solve that problem. So let's move back up to the first question of, does the scene move the plot forward? And let's say that we say, no, this scene doesn't move the plot forward. We're just accepting that. We understand that, no, it's not doing that. Then we want to ask, does the scene contain vital information? So vital information would be anything essential to understanding the novel, sort of as a whole. So sort of the concepts of the novel. So we're not talking about essential to understanding the plot, but essential to understanding the world or the characters or sort of how things work. So this could be magic systems, backstory, key pieces of information that'll come into play later on, things like that. So we want to ask, does this scene contain vital information? Let's assume that you say, no, it doesn't. So the big thing to ask then is, do you like this scene? Do you want to keep this scene? Because if you have a scene that doesn't have momentum and it doesn't have vital information, the best option is going to be to delete it. So as frustrating as it can be to make a scene and then just delete it, sometimes that's really the best option. But if there's something about the scene that's really important to you, which is completely valid, it's a thing that really does happen with writers, is there's scenes or tidbits or pieces from scenes that are just absolutely important to them, and they might not even be able to really pin down why, but it feels essential to the plot, to them, to the writer. It feels essential to them, even if they can't define why. So obviously, if you don't like the scene, delete it. But if you like the scene, then we want to move on to, does the part you like require an entire scene? Is it really just a little piece here and there, a little dialogue, a cutesy moment between characters, something relatively small? So if that's the case, then obviously you can take that and move it to another scene, if possible. If it's something bigger than that and you like sort of the guts of the scene or the core of the scene and you can't really separate that from the context, you sort of have to leave it as it is to get what you want to get out of it. So you sort of just need the whole scene. Then what you're really looking at is that you need to add a sense of momentum to the scene. You need to improve the scene overall and make it more fleshed out and have more of the components that we would expect to see in a scene. So that's going to really help you to take a scene that you really like, and instead of just scrap it and say, well, even though this really means a lot to me, I can't make it work structurally and just throw it away. This will give you an ability to retain that scene that means a lot to you and find a way to really integrate it into the novel. And maybe I'll make a video about how to do this in more depth later on, because I think it could be quite difficult to accomplish, but it is possible. So let's go back and say that this scene does contain vital information. So then we really want to ask, does that information require an entire scene? So there might be vital information that's really minor and doesn't require a whole scene, or there might be vital information that is either so complicated to explain, like it's really long, it requires a lot of dialogue or a lot of narration or just a lot of something to explain. It's a big concept. In that case, it might not make sense to attempt to move that to another scene. It really requires a full scene in and of itself. Another situation could be that how the information is conveyed requires a scene. So if the information has to be obtained from a certain source or from a certain person, it probably doesn't make sense to try to summarize it. You don't really want to say that, oh yeah, the character went and talked to this wizard and the wizard said blah, 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 blah. that's going to feel like a big info dump. And in that case, it's not really possible to not use a full scene to convey that information. What you really want to do is kick back over to the other side of the chart again to add a conflict, because you're really going to need to have a reason that the information isn't just directly told. So if they go to see the wizard needs to have a reason that he doesn't just spill the beans immediately. Maybe they have to prove themselves or fight for the information or fight to get to the wizard. There needs to be some scene elements, so it's not just conveying information. Then if the information does not require an entire scene, we have to ask, is it possible to move it to another scene? And that's where, again, it's possible that you can't move it to another scene. It's possible that maybe the character only has access to the wizard for a short window of the novel, so you can't just say it happens in the first quarter. It has to happen in the third quarter, or it has to happen in a really narrow section of the third quarter. You can't just say, never mind, that happened somewhere else. So even when the information doesn't require an entire scene, sometimes it's still not possible to move it to another scene because it has to sort of slot between two plot points, if that makes sense. So in that case, again, you're really looking at needing to add a conflict and needing to flesh it out into a bigger scene. Of course, if it is possible to move that information to another scene, you would do well to just do that, to go ahead and move that information to another scene where it can be integrated and it won't cause you any problems with your pacing. So that is the flow chart. I really hope that you found it helpful. I hope it wasn't too complicated. I tried to make it as simple as possible and to try to order things in a way that would feel logical. If you do have any questions about the flow chart, you can go ahead and put those in the comments and I will try to get to them as much as possible. The next video I think is going to be a video about one of the writer types. If you didn't see my video about the writer types, I'll put a link in the description. But I think I'm going to cover just one type at a time with an in-depth video about sort of tips and strategies for that writer type and like how you can use your type to your advantage. So let me know if you have a preference for which of those types I cover first. I really hope that you found this video helpful, and I look forward to making another video for you guys soon. Happy writing!